So what is restructuring? Restructuring is when a company has a program in place, planned and controlled by management, and it will materially change either the scope that the business undertakes or the way the business is conducted. So let's just think of a few examples. Well, let's say they have retail stores across Canada and they decide to sell all of the retail locations in Quebec. So in that case, they're going to sell a huge portion of the business. It might also be true that they're going to close a location. The GM plant being closed in Oshawa is a perfect example, right? They're going to close that whole business location. It might also be true that they're going to move. So for instance, when Gillette shut down their operations in Quebec and they moved all those operations to United States. It could also mean that the company is going to restructure its organization. So let's say the organization had a very big pyramid, so there was lots of layers of management, and they want to remove one whole layer of management. So if they're doing that kind of management restructuring and they're eliminating a layer of management, then that would be an example of restructuring. Basically, if a company does a fundamental change to its organization that will have a really big or material effect on the way the company is run, that is an example of restructuring. So what happens when a company meets one of these definitions of restructuring? If a company is restructuring, they may have to recognize a provision for restructuring costs. Now keep in mind, a provision would be actually a debit to an expense and a credit to a liability. So you can imagine if a company restructures, they may have to record this provision, which will increase their expenses and increase their liability. This type of liability is called a constructive obligation. What is a constructive obligation? So there's two kinds of obligations. There's a legal obligation, which is because there's a contract between two parties, or there's some kind of legislation that makes the company have to do something, or there could be some kind of law. That's called a legal obligation, but a constructive obligation is very different. It's an obligation that comes about because of the company's past actions. What happens is the company's actions has basically set up a pattern. Because they have set up this pattern in the past that would indicate to everybody that they're going to accept their responsibilities, they have created an expectation that they will step up and take on those responsibilities. That's a constructive obligation. So you can see how restructuring costs are a constructive obligation for a business. Now, you can see what a constructive obligation is. How does this meet the whole concept of restructuring costs and providing a provision? We're going to go over the criteria that would result in a constructive obligation for restructuring actually existing and having to be recorded. Let's look at the criteria. First, there has to be a detailed formal plan for restructuring. What does this mean? It means you know the part of the business that is going to be affected. You know the employees who will be terminated. It also means you have an idea how much it's going to cost you. And you know when the plan will be implemented. Second thing is, the business must have created some kind of expectation in the individuals who are going to be affected by this restructuring by doing either one of two things. They must have started implementing the plan. So for instance, they could have started taking apart the factory, or they could have started selling the assets. Or two, they've made a public announcement about everything. Like GM made a public announcement and said exactly what they were going to do with regards to closing the plant. So the public announcement has to be really detailed plans about what the restructuring is going to look like and who it's going to affect. Note that if they've only made an announcement about the plan, it also has to be true that the plan will be implemented in a short period of time before they're able to make a whole bunch of changes to it. So it's got to be imminent. I'm just going to move the page down. Now, If all of this is true, and keep in mind that the first item includes that you have an idea of how much it will cost you, then make a provision. What has to be true about the provision? The provision must be a reliable estimate. That means that any costs which you cannot reliably estimate must be omitted. It has to be reported as part of the continuing operations on the income statement. So it's part of continuing operations. However, it must have its own line item. That means we can't bury it and just put it in miscellaneous operating expenses. No, it has to be denoted as restructuring costs. The details of the plan must be disclosed in the notes to the financial statements. So let's just unpack what costs have to be included. Any costs which are caused by the restructuring. So what does that exclude? Well, if you have a vice president who's going to remain in the company but is working full-time on the restructuring, you can't take that vice president's salary and place it as part of the restructuring costs, because that cost is associated with the continuing operations of the business. There are a few things that can never be included in the costs. So for instance, let's say you're keeping that vice president, but you have to retrain them or relocate them. That can't be included in the provision because that's not part of the stopping. It's part of the continuing. If you are doing some kind of marketing campaign because the restructuring is sending a negative message to the public or the stakeholders, you can't include that either. If you have to invest in some kind of new shipping networks, right? Because you're shipping products, and before you ship from Quebec and now you're going to ship from the United States, that can't be included in the restructuring either, because that's all about moving forward. Think about the fact that anything that has to do with the future of the business would not be included in the provision. So great, let's assume that we have to do an entry, a debit to the expense and a credit to the liability. Well, what if things change moving forward? The restructuring, if for instance, if I'm closing a plant, it might take me a year or more to close the plant. What if our estimates change? If there has to be a change in the provision, then that change will be recorded in the current reporting period when that change becomes known. Why is that? Because that would be a change in estimate, and a change in estimate is always dealt with prospectively, moving forward. Provisions for restructuring.